grandmother stood in the doorway of a burning building, and the heat coming off the flames had melted the snow on her boots before she even crossed the threshold. The roundhouse was dying around her. 12 bays of brick and timber that had stood since 1903, that had housed steam locomotives during 2 world wars, that had seen her grandfather start and end his career within their walls. All of it now consumed by orange light that climbed the rafters like something hungry, like something patient that had been waiting for permission to feed. She didn't stop. She didn't think. She moved. Her boots cracked across the concrete floor where oil stains from 60 years of locomotive maintenance had soaked so deep they would never come out. Past the pit where engineers had once stood to grease the undersides of giants. Past the turntable that had not turned in decades. Past bay number 7, where her grandfather Wendell had pointed when she was 7 years old and said the words she had not understood until tonight. This is where I called my real home. The smoke pulled the air from her lungs and replaced it with something that tasted like old paint and pine pitch and the chemical sweetness of accelerant. Someone had wanted this place gone. Someone had wanted it gone tonight. She found the dispatcher's desk by feel as much as sight. The old oak surface familiar now after weeks of running her hands across the carved letters. Otis Pemberton, 1965 to 1995. 30 years of a man's life carved into a desk that was about to become ash. She dropped to her knees and pried at the loose floorboard with fingers already raw from the work of the last 6 weeks. The tin box was where she had hidden it the day before, the day she had understood that the lawsuit was a feint. The day she had understood that the men coming for her were not interested in due process. She pulled it free and held it against her chest and felt the metal already warm through her coat. A beam fell somewhere behind her. The sound was less a crash than a slow exhalation, an old building deciding it had carried weight long enough. She ran. 3 months earlier, on a February evening, when the snow over Elkins, West Virginia had been falling for 16 hours, Sloane Renner had walked home from her shift at the coffee shop on Davis Avenue, carrying a paper bag of day-old pastries the owner had let her take. 20 years old, 5'6", brown hair pulled back into the kind of low ponytail her grandfather Wendell had taught her was the only proper way for a working woman to wear her hair. Because anything else got caught in machinery or in the eyes of the people you were trying to talk to. Around her neck, beneath 2 layers of shirt and her thrifted wool coat, the chronometer pressed against her sternum on its leather cord. Hamilton, 992B railroad grade, 8 days between windings if you treated it right. Her grandfather had carried it for 33 years on the Western Maryland line, and her father had carried it for 9 years after that. It had stopped ticking exactly twice in those 42 years. Once when her father had died, once when her grandfather had died. Both times she had wound it again, set it again, brought it back to railroad time. She climbed the porch steps of the house on Stonewall Street where she had lived since she was 4 years old. The porch light was on. That was the first thing she registered. The porch light was on, which meant her mother knew she was coming home, which meant the locks had been changed. She tried the front door first because that was where you always tried first. The brass knob she had turned 10,000 times now refused to turn, refused even to acknowledge the key that had opened it that morning. She tried the side door off the kitchen, the one her grandfather had rebuilt himself in the summer of 2014. Same result. She tried the basement bulkhead, the one her father had welded shut in places after a flood and welded open again in others. Locked. Every door in her childhood home had been changed against her in the time it had taken her to make minimum wage at a coffee shop on a Tuesday in February. She came back to the porch slowly, the snow loud beneath her boots. The cardboard box was there. She had not seen it the first time because she'd been looking at the door. looking at the keyhole, looking for something familiar to put a key into. The box was the kind a moving company sells you. Brown, corrugated, the seams sealed with packing tape. On top of the tape, held in place by a small flat stone someone had brought up from the yard, was a handwritten note. Her stepfather's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. Curtis Sutton had a lawyer's hand, all sharp ascenders and tight loops, the writing of a man who billed by the hour and made sure his signatures were legible. Sloan, your mother and I have decided this arrangement is no longer working. Your belongings are in the box. Please do not attempt to enter the house. Do not contact your mother for the time being. We need space to think. Curtis. The wind picked up. The snow blew sideways across the porch and landed on the note and began to dissolve the ink. She read it again before it could become unreadable. She read it a third time because she did not believe what she was reading. Then she saw the chronometer. Her grandfather's watch was sitting on top of the cardboard box on top of her clothes, and her books, and the photograph of her father in his Pennsylvania Conrail jacket. The leather cord was coiled neatly. The watch face was up, catching the porch light. The hands read 7:47. She stared at it. She stared at it because she could not understand what it was doing there. The chronometer lived in a velvet-lined wooden box on her dresser. It had lived there since her grandfather had died, and her mother had given it to her and said, "Keep this safe. This is the only thing of his that matters." The chronometer did not leave that box. The chronometer was wound on Sundays at 6 in the evening, a ritual her grandfather had performed for 33 years. And that she had performed every Sunday since she was 13. Her mother had taken it out of the box and put it on top of the cardboard. Her mother, who knew exactly what it meant. Her mother, who had sat next to her grandfather at his kitchen table and watched him wind the same watch every Sunday at 6. Her mother, who had cried when she had handed it to Sloan after the funeral and said, "Your grandfather wanted you to have this because he said you were the only one of us who understood." Her mother had taken the chronometer out of its velvet-lined box and placed it on top of a cardboard box of clothes on a porch in February in the middle of a snowstorm. Sloan picked it up. Her fingers were shaking, and the cold made the shaking worse, and she had to use both hands to lift the watch and bring it to her ear. The faint, familiar tick was still there, the rhythm she had memorized before she had memorized the alphabet. 3 seconds per month accuracy if you treated it right, 5 if you did not. She slipped the leather cord over her head and tucked the watch beneath her shirt and felt it settle against her sternum where it belonged. Then she picked up the cardboard box and walked off the porch and did not look back at the house on Stonewall Street. The diner on 3rd Avenue was 12 blocks away. Sloan carried the cardboard box for 10 of those blocks before her arms gave out, and she had to set it down in the snow and take a breath and pick it up again. The wind was coming down off the Allegheny ridges and finding every gap in her coat. The pastries from the coffee shop were somewhere in the box now. She had forgotten she was carrying them when she had set the bag on top of her clothes. Loretta Bishop saw her through the window before she got to the door. 64 years old, gray hair, pinned-up apron stained with coffee and cooking grease, and the small permanent marks of 40 years standing behind a counter. Loretta opened the door and held it open and did not ask what had happened. She just stepped aside and let Sloan carry the box past her into the warmth. The diner was almost empty. A trucker in the back booth eating a late dinner. A woman at the counter nursing a cup of decaf and reading a paperback. The fluorescent lights hummed the way they always hummed, and the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee was the same as it had always been. And for a moment, Sloan could not remember why she was holding a cardboard box full of her own clothes. Loretta took her elbow and walked her past the counter and down the narrow hallway behind the kitchen to a door Sloan had never been through. The door opened onto a flight of stairs. The stairs led to a small room above the diner with a bed and a chair and a window that looked out over the alley. Loretta's voice was rough from 40 years of cigarettes she had quit a decade ago. There's clean sheets in the closet, bathrooms at the end of the hall. You can stay as long as you need to stay. Sloan set the cardboard box on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry, because Renners did not cry, because her grandfather had told her once that crying was a luxury working people could not afford, that you could feel everything you wanted to feel after the work was done. The work was not done. She did not know yet what the work was going to be. She just knew that her mother had placed her grandfather's watch on top of a cardboard box. And that meant something, because her mother did not do anything by accident, because her mother had grown up in a railroad family and had learned the same lessons Sloan had learned about the meaning of small placements and the message in a hand of cards laid down a particular way. Her mother had been telling her something. Her mother had been telling her something she could not put into words. Sloan took out the chronometer and wound it. 8 turns of the crown. The same 8 turns her grandfather had performed every Sunday at 6 for 33 years. She was going to figure out what her mother had been trying to say. For 2 months, she lived in the room above the diner. She worked the morning shift at the coffee shop and the dinner shift at Loretta's. And she slept 5 hours a night, and she did not call her mother, and her mother did not call her. The cardboard box stayed in the corner of the room unpacked. The chronometer hung against her chest day and night. In April, the snow had begun to recede from the higher elevations of the Allegheny Mountains, and the dogwoods on the west side of Elkins had started to consider blooming. Sloan was washing dishes in the back of the diner on a Saturday morning when the radio above the prep counter began to play a public radio program out of Charleston. She didn't pay attention at first. She was elbow deep in suds, and her arms were tired, and her mind was somewhere else the way it had been. Somewhere else for 2 months, running and running on the question of what her mother had meant and getting no answer. The host was interviewing someone from a county government office about surplus property auctions. Old buildings the counties wanted to get rid of, schoolhouses, granges, fire stations, the kind of structures that small towns had built when they had thought small towns would last forever. Then the host said the words that stopped her hands in the water. Tucker County is auctioning a former Western Maryland Railway roundhouse at the old Parsons Junction site for $10. The building is scheduled for demolition on May 15th if no buyer steps forward to take ownership. Sloan stood with her hands in the soapy water, and she didn't move. Her grandfather, Wendell Renner, had worked on the Western Maryland Railway from 1955 until 1988, 33 years. He had started as a brakeman and finished as a senior locomotive engineer, and he had spoken about that line the way some men spoke about their first love. The Parsons Junction Roundhouse had been the place he had reported to every morning for the first 12 years of his career. He had told her about it at the kitchen table when she was a child, the way other grandfathers told fairy tales. 12 bays, brick walls 2 feet thick, a turntable that could swing a Mikado-class locomotive 90 degrees in under 3 minutes. She had been there once. She had been 7 years old. He had driven her up into Tucker County one Saturday in October, and they had walked through the empty roundhouse together, and he had pointed to bay number 7, and he had said something to her she had not understood at the time, but had remembered word for 13 years. This is where I called my real home. The Parsons Junction Roundhouse was for sale for $10. She had $10 in her wallet. She had counted it that morning. A $5 bill, 4 ones and 4 quarters, all of it left over from the tips on her last shift after she had paid Loretta what she owed for the room. She turned off the faucet and dried her hands on her apron and went to find Loretta. The drive up to the Tucker County Administrative Office took an hour and 20 minutes in Loretta's old Ford Escort. Loretta had lent her the car without question, had filled the tank with gas, had given her a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and a hand-drawn map showing where she was supposed to go. They had not discussed it. Loretta had simply done these things, and Sloan had simply accepted them. And that was the way the relationship had been working for 2 months. And that was the way they both seemed to want to keep it. The county building was a 2-story brick structure on the main street of Parsons. Inside, a thin woman in her late 50s sat behind a desk with a sign that read, Marlene Whitley County Clerk. She had short steel gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of tired competence that came from running a small county office for 2 decades on a budget that kept getting smaller. Sloan set the $10 on the desk. I'm here to buy the Roundhouse. Marlene looked at her over the rim of her glasses for a long moment. She did not pick up the money. She did not reach for the deed book. She looked at Sloan the way a person looks at someone walking too close to the edge of a cliff and trying to decide whether to call out a warning. You should know there's another buyer interested. Has he signed papers yet? Not yet. He's coming in this afternoon. His office called yesterday. He's been calling for 3 weeks asking about the property. Sloan felt her hands go still on the desk. The chronometer ticked against her chest. Who is it? Marlene watched her for another long moment. Then she said the name. Tate Holloway. Holloway Development. They want the land for a solar generation facility. The Roundhouse is in their way. Sloan had grown up hearing the Holloway name. Everyone in north-central West Virginia had grown up hearing the Holloway name. Tate Holloway's grandfather, Jasper, had been the regional general manager of the railroad before deregulation broke it apart. Tate's father, Eldon, had been a state senator for 16 years. Tate himself ran a development company that had bought up half the abandoned industrial land in 3 counties and turned it into storage facilities, solar farms, and the occasional Dollar General. The Holloway name had also been on the bottom of the official report that had ruled her father's death an accident. Sloan heard her own voice say what it said next, and she was surprised by how steady it was. I'd like to sign the papers now, before he gets here. Marlene looked at her for one more moment. Then she pulled the deed book from the shelf behind her, the kind of oversized leather-bound volume that predated computers, and turned to a page that had been bookmarked with a yellow post-it note. She set the book on the desk and turned it toward Sloan and slid a pen across. Sign here, and here, and here. Sloan signed her name 3 times in the careful, slanted script her grandfather had taught her when she was 6 years old. Sloan Marie Renner. The same script she had used on every important document of her life since the day she had been old enough to need a signature. Marlene took the $10 and folded the bill once with precise movements and tucked it into a metal cash box that might itself have been older than the building. She stamped the deed with a brass stamp, and the soft percussive sound of the stamp closing was like a door clicking shut very far away. It's yours. The access road is gravel for the last 1.25 miles. There's no power. There's no running water. The roof is failing in 3 places. You should know all that before you walk out of here. I know. Marlene held her gaze. There was something in her face that had not been there at the start of the conversation. It was not pity. It was something closer to attention, as if she had decided in the space of the last few minutes that the young woman in front of her was worth paying attention to. You knew the building before today. My grandfather worked there. 33 years on the Western Maryland. Marlene nodded slowly. What was his name? Wendell Renner. The clerk's expression did something complicated. She looked away for a moment at the window at the spring light coming in through the Venetian blinds. Then she looked back. I knew Wendell. Not well, but I knew him. He used to come in every November to pay his property taxes in person because he didn't trust the mail. He was a careful man. Yes, ma'am. You take care of that building, I will. Sloan was sitting in the front seat of Loretta's Escort the Deed, in a manila envelope on the passenger side when a black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the parking lot. She watched in the rearview mirror as a man in his mid-40s got out and walked into the county building. He was wearing a dark suit and dark shoes, and he moved the way men with money moved unhurried, certain that nothing would happen until he arrived. He did not look at her car. He did not look at anything except the front door of the building. She watched him go inside. Then she started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, and 20 minutes later she was on the access road, and a mile and a quarter after that, she was looking through a windshield at a brick roundhouse she had not seen in 13 years. The building was bigger than she had remembered. 12 arched bay doors faced her in a curving arc, each one 15 feet high and 12 feet wide. The brick had darkened to the color of old blood, the mortar weathered out in places, the iron lintels above the doors furred with rust. The roof was visibly sagging on the far end. Slate tiles had slid loose and accumulated in piles along the perimeter where they had fallen. The smokestack rising from the back of the building was cracked from the cap halfway down its length. Above the central bay, the painted sign was still legible after 60 years of weather. Western Maryland Railway, Parsons Junction. Below that, smaller letters, established 1903. She got out of the car. The chronometer ticked against her chest. The door of bay number 7 was unlocked. She had known it would be unlocked. The county had stopped securing the building years ago because there was nothing inside worth stealing, and the locks themselves were rusted to the point of uselessness. She pushed the door inward. It moved on hinges that protested but did not refuse, and the smell of the building hit her before her eyes had adjusted to the dim light. Coal dust, machine oil, the chemical sweetness of old rubber gaskets that had perished in place. A faint mineral scent of mortar slowly returning to sand. And underneath all of it, a smell she could not name, but that she recognized at the level of memory, the smell of the place her grandfather had walked into every morning for 12 years before she had been born. She stepped inside. The roundhouse opened around her like a cathedral. 12 bays radiating from a central turntable, each one designed to hold a single locomotive while it was being serviced or stored. The roof rose 40 feet at the apex. Iron trusses spanned the space blackened by decades of coal smoke. Pigeons had been the most recent tenants, judging by the white drifts of guano along the rafters and the soft cooing she could hear from somewhere up near the cupola. She walked the perimeter slowly. Each bay held the ghost of what it had once contained. Inspection pits ran the length of the floor in 3 of them. The concrete walls of the pit stained black with 8 decades of accumulated drippings. Tool benches lined the walls between bays, some of them still bearing the chalk marks where mechanics had labeled their wrenches and gauges. A single locomotive sand bin still stood in the corner of bay 9, half full of sand that had not been touched since 1962. She came to bay number 7 and stopped. The bay looked like all the others. There was nothing remarkable about it. There was an inspection pit. There was a tool bench. There was a single light fixture suspended from the ceiling that would not have worked even if there had been power. There was a chalk mark on the wall that might have been a tally of something or might have been nothing at all. But she was 7 years old again, and her grandfather was holding her hand, and his hand was the size of a baseball glove and as warm as a stove, and he was pointing at this bay, and he was saying the words, "This is where I called my real home." She had asked him why. She had been 7, and she had asked him why a place that smelled like oil and was full of broken machines was his real home. And he had laughed, and he had said something she had not understood at the time, but that she had memorized anyway because that was the kind of child she had been. A man's real home is the place where he does the work that matters, not the place where he sleeps, the place where the work happens. Remember that, Sloan. When you grow up, find your real home. It might not be where you expected it to be. She stood in bay number 7 for a long time. Then she walked toward the back of the roundhouse where the dispatcher's office had been built into the rear wall. The office was a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a single window that looked out over the rail yard. The window was unbroken, which was a small miracle. The floor was wooden plank rather than concrete, and the planks had been worn soft by 60 years of foot traffic. There was a desk against the back wall, a heavy oak desk with a roll top that had been pulled down and locked at some point in the past. There was a stool in front of the desk. There was a small iron stove in the corner with its flue pipe disappearing into the ceiling. She tried the roll top. It was stuck but not locked, and after a few minutes of patient pressure, it gave way and rolled up into its housing with a sound like an old man sighing. The desk surface was empty except for a green blotter and a brass lamp with no bulb. But the desk surface was carved. Someone had taken a knife or a chisel and carved letters into the oak of the desk deep enough that no amount of cleaning would ever remove them. The letters were 3 inches high and had been carved in the careful, blocky style of a man who had taken pride in his lettering. Otis Pemberton Dispatcher, 1965 to 1995. 30 years. One man's name, one man's tenure carved into the only piece of furniture in the room. Sloane sat down on the stool and looked at the carved name and tried to remember whether her grandfather had ever mentioned an Otis Pemberton. She could not remember. Her grandfather had retired in 1988 before this Pemberton had finished his run. Their tenures had overlapped by 23 years, but her grandfather had been a road engineer and Otis had been a yard dispatcher, and the two jobs did not necessarily put men into the same orbit. She got up and walked the perimeter of the small office. She tested the floorboards as she went the way her father had taught her to test floorboards when she was 9 years old, and they'd been replacing the porch on the house on Stonewall Street. Most of the boards were solid. Some had the slight give that meant the joist beneath had begun to rot. One of them, the one directly under the stool in front of the desk, was different. It was loose. She knelt down and pressed on the corner of the board. The opposite end lifted clear. The board had been cut along its full length and reset without nails held in place only by the weight of the stool and the friction of the surrounding planks. She lifted it free and set it aside. The cavity beneath the floor was the size of a footlocker. A leather satchel sat in the cavity. Beside the satchel, a small canvas bag, the kind a banker might have used to carry coins. Beside the canvas bag, a single metal object that caught what little light came through the window and reflected it in a way that made her stop breathing. She lifted the satchel out first because it was the largest object, and because she did not yet trust herself to touch the metal thing she had seen. Inside the satchel was a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked but intact. The pages were dry and yellowed but legible. She set the journal on the desk. She lifted the canvas bag next. It was heavy. She loosened the drawstring and tipped a small portion of the contents into her palm and saw old paper currency 20s and 50s and a few hundreds. The bills brittle at the edges where the paper bands holding them had begun to crumble. She didn't count the money. She put it back in the bag and set the bag on the desk next to the journal. Then she reached into the cavity and lifted out the metal object. It was a badge, Pennsylvania Conrail Standard Issue, Track Inspector Grade, the kind of badge an inspector was required to surrender when he left the company's employ. Except that this one had not been surrendered. This one had ended up under a floorboard in a roundhouse in Tucker County, hidden along with a bag of money and a leather journal. The name engraved on the front of the badge was her father's, Gideon Renner, Inspector, Conrail Division 4, issued 2008. Sloane sat down on the stool and held the badge in her hands and could not feel the cold of the metal because she could not feel anything. Her father had died on October 15, 2017. She had been 12 years old. The official report had ruled it a workplace accident, a section of bridge over the Cheat River that had collapsed during a routine inspection. Her father had been on top of the bridge when it had given way. He had fallen 40 feet into the river with the wreckage. They had not recovered his body for 3 days. She had never asked what had happened to his badge. She had assumed it had been buried with him the way her grandfather's railroad watch had been intended for burial before her grandfather had given it to her instead. She had assumed his badge was in the casket at the cemetery in Beverly with his name on the marker and her mother's flowers on the grass above. But the badge was here, under a floorboard, in a roundhouse he had no reason to visit, hidden by a man named Otis Pemberton who had retired before her father had even joined Conrail. She set the badge on the desk and reached for the journal. The handwriting in the journal was careful, slanted the kind of hand a man developed when he had spent 4 decades writing waybills and dispatch logs. The early entries were routine: train movements, weather conditions, notes on equipment maintenance. The journal began in 1965 and continued with gaps of months and sometimes years, all the way to 2017. She turned to the back. The most recent entries, the entry from October 12, 2017, took up 2 full pages. Gideon Renner came to see me again today. 3rd time in 2 weeks. He thinks the Cheat River Bridge collapse last August was not an accident. He thinks somebody arranged it. He has been gathering documentation for 6 months. He showed me the photographs today, and I will say this much. I have looked at a lot of bridges in my life, and I have never seen a hanger bolt that failed the way that one failed without being helped. He says he has a list of names. He says he knows who signed off on the inspection report that called it routine wear. He says the names go all the way to the top of the regional office. I told him to stop. I told him men like that do not lose. I told him he has a wife and a daughter. He said he has a wife and a daughter who deserve a father who does honest work and tells the truth when the truth is hard. He said his own father raised him to believe that. I asked him what he wanted me to do. He said he wanted to leave the documentation with me. He said he did not trust banks, and he did not trust safe deposit boxes, and he did not trust the Inspector General's office. He said the only people he trusted were the old railroad men. He said his father had told him before he died that if you ever need to hide something where the wrong people will not look for it, hide it in a building they have already forgotten about. So I am hiding it. I am hiding the documentation under the floor of the dispatcher's office in the Parsons Junction Roundhouse. I am hiding his badge with the documentation because he asked me to, because he said his daughter would want to have it someday. He left an hour ago. He said he was driving to Charleston tomorrow to deliver the original documentation to a journalist he trusts. He said he will be back by Friday. If he does not come back by Friday, I'm going to have to figure out what to do. Sloan turned the page. The next entry was 3 days later, October 15th, 2017, the day her father had died. Gideon Renner did not come back. The news this morning said he fell from the Cheat River Bridge while inspecting it. The news said it was an accident. I do not believe in accidents anymore. She closed the journal. Outside the window of the dispatcher's office, the sun was beginning to set behind the western ridge. The light coming through the window had turned the color of old brass. The dust in the air moved slowly through the light the way dust always moves through light at the end of an afternoon, indifferent to whether anyone is watching it or not. Sloan sat very still on the wooden stool. Her hands were resting on the closed journal. The chronometer ticked against her chest. The badge of her father was on the desk in front of her, and the canvas bag of money beside it, and the leather journal beneath her hands, and outside the dispatcher's office, the empty roundhouse stretched into the dimness, and the building that had been her grandfather's real home had just become, in the space of 1 hour, the place where she had learned that her father had been murdered. She was 20 years old. She had $10 less than nothing in the world. She had nowhere to go. She had work to do. She slept that night on the wooden floor of the dispatcher's office, wrapped in a sleeping bag she had pulled from the cardboard box in Loretta's car. She had driven the car back down the access road to a turnaround at the bottom of the hill and walked the 1.25 miles back up with her duffel and her sleeping bag and the journal pressed against her chest under her coat. She did not light a fire in the small iron stove because she did not know whether the flue still drew. She did not eat. She had brought a sandwich from Loretta's, but her stomach had refused to consider it. She set the chronometer on the desk in front of her and watched the second hand move and listened to the building settle around her in the cold. She thought about her father. She thought about him standing in this room. She thought about him walking through the empty bays of the Roundhouse, the same bays she had walked through that afternoon. She thought about him pulling up the same loose floorboard she had pulled up. She thought about him handing his inspector's badge to a retired dispatcher he barely knew and asking him to hide it. She thought about why he would have done that. A man hides his badge in a building scheduled for demolition because he believes he might not survive long enough to wear it again. A man hides his documentation in the floor of a roundhouse because he believes the people who want him dead will search his house and his car and his office and his safe deposit box. A man entrusts a stranger with the most important evidence of his life because he has run out of people he can trust. Her father had known he was going to die. He had known, and he had hidden the proof of why. And he had hidden it in the one building that connected his life to her grandfather's, and her grandfather's to her own, the one building in the world that bore both Renner generations in its walls. He had hidden it where she would find it if she ever found her way to it. He had not come back from Charleston, but he had left her a map. The dawn came slow and gray. Sloane woke before sunrise, the way her grandfather had trained her to wake, the way her father had woken every morning of his working life. She wound the chronometer. She drank cold coffee from Loretta's thermos. She ate half the sandwich and made herself eat the other half. Then she heard the engine. It was coming up the access road. A heavy engine, deep, expensive, not a county truck, not a delivery vehicle. Something private. She looked through the window of the dispatcher's office and saw the black Lincoln Navigator come around the last curve of the road and pull into the open ground in front of the roundhouse. The driver's door opened. Tate Holloway got out. He was wearing the same dark suit he had worn yesterday in the parking lot of the county building. He stood next to his vehicle for a moment and looked at the roundhouse the way a man looks at a building he has already decided he owns. Then he walked toward the door of bay number 7, the door Sloane had left propped open the previous evening. She put the journal in the leather satchel. She put the badge and the canvas bag in with the journal. She shoved the satchel under the floorboard and replaced the board and pushed the stool over it and stood up. She heard his footsteps cross the concrete floor of the roundhouse. He came to the doorway of the dispatcher's office and stopped. He took in the room with one slow look, the empty desk, the stool, the young woman standing behind the desk in a thrifted wool coat and yesterday's clothes. When he spoke, his voice was warmer than she had expected. It was the voice of a man who had read books on persuasion and had practiced the cadences in front of a mirror. "You're Sloane Renner." She said nothing. He smiled. It was a careful smile. It did not reach his eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't get to congratulate you yesterday on the purchase. Marlene told me you were in and out before I got there. That's a hell of a story." Still, she said nothing. The chronometer ticked against her chest. "I knew your father." The ticking of the chronometer seemed to slow. Or perhaps the room had simply gone quieter the way rooms went quiet when something important was about to be said. "Gideon was a good man. We were sorry to lose him on that bridge. My condolences. I should have offered them when we met yesterday, but I didn't realize who you were." Sloane felt the shape of the satchel beneath the floorboard, beneath the stool, beneath her boots. She felt the chronometer against her sternum. She felt the cold of the dispatcher's office and the cold of the morning beyond it, and the cold of every winter she had spent watching her mother grieve a man she had not known had been murdered. She heard her own voice say what it said next, and it was very level and it was very quiet. Mr. Holloway. I never told the county clerk who my father was. His expression did not change. The smile stayed where it was fixed in place, the muscles around his mouth holding it carefully. Beg your pardon. I said I never told the county clerk that my father was Gideon Renner. I gave her my name. She knew my grandfather was Wendell Renner. She didn't know my father. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he tilted his head slightly, the way a man tilts his head when he is recalibrating. Word gets around in a small county. Word does, but not that fast, and not from her. He held the smile a little longer. Then he let it go, and what was underneath it was not warmer. My father wants to meet you. He's not well. He doesn't get out much these days. But when he heard about the sale yesterday, when he heard your name, he asked me to extend an invitation. He says he knew Wendell. He says he has things he'd like to tell you about your family. Outside the dispatcher's office window, the morning light was strengthening across the empty rail yard. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once and then was silent. Sloane Renner stood in a roundhouse her grandfather had called his real home, and she looked at the man whose family had ruined her own family 3 generations running, and she understood with perfect clarity that the work her father had started had just become her work, and that she was not going to put it down until it was done. Tell your father, she said, that I know what his family did. Tate Holloway did not move for a long moment. The smile was gone from his face entirely now, and what had replaced it was the expression of a man who had been calculating numbers in his head and had just been handed a different set of numbers. He looked at her the way a poker player looks at an opponent who has unexpectedly raised the stakes, carefully, without anger, without anything in his eyes that a witness could later describe as a threat. Then he nodded once slowly as if she had said something reasonable. I think you've been under a great deal of stress lately, Miss Renner. Losing your home, losing your family, coming up here on a foolish errand to buy a building that's about to fall down on top of you. I'd like to make this easier for you. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and produced a checkbook. He set it on the corner of the desk between her and him, and he uncapped a pen. $25,000 today. You sign a transfer of the deed back to my company. You take the check, you walk away from this building, and we never have to have another conversation. You can find a place to live. You can finish your education. You can put all of this behind you. She looked at the checkbook. She looked at his pen. She thought about $25,000. She thought about what $25,000 meant to a 20-year-old woman who had been sleeping in a room above a diner for 2 months. She thought about what her father would have said to a man offering her $25,000 to walk away from the only evidence he had left behind. Her father would have said no. Her father had said no. Her father had been killed for saying no. She said no. She said it without raising her voice. She said it without making a speech of it. She said the single word, and then she said nothing else, and she let the silence in the dispatcher's office grow until it filled every corner of the room. Tate Holloway capped his pen. He picked up the checkbook. He returned both to his pocket with movements that were as careful as everything else about him. I see, he said. You should leave. I will. But I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. You're a young woman with no resources, no family support, and no legal experience sitting in a building that the county has scheduled for demolition. The deed you signed yesterday was contingent on a number of conditions you don't appear to be aware of. Conditions about habitability, conditions about preservation timelines, My attorneys will be reviewing all of that. He paused at the doorway of the small office. In the meantime, my father's invitation stands. He's 80 years old. He has emphysema. He won't last another year. If you have something to say to him about my family, you should say it before he is no longer in a position to hear it. Otherwise, you will spend the rest of your life regretting that you missed the chance. He left. She listened to his footsteps cross the concrete floor of the roundhouse. She listened to the door of the navigator open and close. She listened to the engine start and the gravel crunch under the tires as he turned the vehicle around and drove back down the access road. When the sound of the engine had faded, she sat down on the stool above the loose floorboard and she put her face in her hands and she allowed herself for the first time in 2 months to shake. Bram Calloway came up the access road on a Saturday morning in the second week of April, driving a 1996 Chevrolet pickup with rust along the wheel wells and a toolbox in the bed that looked older than Sloan was. He was 72 years old, 6 feet tall, with hands the size of cast iron skillets, and the slow, careful movements of a man who had learned to conserve energy because he no longer had energy to waste. Marlene Whitley had sent him. She had called Sloan the day after the encounter with Tate Holloway and had said in the careful voice of a county employee who knew her phone might be monitored that she had spoken to a man who knew the building. He was a mason. He had done work all over Tucker and Randolph counties for 50 years. He owed her husband a favor. She had told him about the young woman at the Roundhouse. He had said he would come up on Saturday. His name, Marlene had said, was Bram Calloway. He had known her grandfather. He climbed out of the truck without hurry and walked the perimeter of the building before he ever looked at Sloan. He examined the brick. He examined the lintels. He climbed up onto the platform and tested several boards with the toe of his boot. He came back to where she was standing and looked at her with eyes that had been the same color she suspected since the day he had been born. Pale gray, direct. When he spoke, his voice was rough but not unkind. "Marlene says you bought this place for $10. "Yes, sir. She says you intend to fix it." "Yes, sir. She says you're Wendell Renner's granddaughter." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a long moment. He took off his cap and ran a hand through hair that was the color of iron filings and put the cap back on. "Your grandfather pulled me out of a boiler explosion in Hagerstown in 1987. The fitter had cross-threaded a steam line and the gauge gave up at 400 pounds per square inch and the whole assembly let go. I was on top of the engine when it blew. I should have been killed. Wendell Renner was the engineer that day. He was the one who saw it coming and reached up through the steam and pulled me down off that locomotive before the second tank let go. Burned his hands so bad they had to graft skin off his thigh. I was 28 years old. I had a wife and a baby on the way. He never let me thank him properly. Said it was his job. Said any man would have done it." He looked at her. "I have been waiting 38 years to do something for that family. I am here. I will work for materials only. I will be here every Saturday and every Sunday from now until you tell me to stop or until I am too old to hold a trowel. We will start with the chimney and the roof over bay number 7. Do you understand me?" She nodded. She did not trust her voice. "Good." He bent and lifted a canvas tool roll out of the bed of the pickup. "Now show me what you found under that floor." She showed him. She did not show him the journal at first. She showed him the badge and the canvas bag of money. She watched his face as he turned the badge over in his hand and read the engraved name on the front. She watched him close his hand around the badge and hold it for a moment before he gave it back to her. "I knew your daddy too," he said. "Not well, but I met him once. He came out to ask me about a foundation problem on a railroad bridge over near Davis. He was the kind of man asked good questions. He listened to the answers. There aren't many of those left. When she showed him the journal, he sat down on the stool in the dispatcher's office and read the last 3 entries without speaking. He read them twice. Then he closed the journal and set it on the desk and rested his enormous hand on top of it like a benediction. You know what this is? Yes, sir. You know what it means? Yes, sir. You know who you are dealing with? Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long time. Then we had better get to work. The first week, they tarped the roof over the dispatcher's office in bay number 7. The tarp was 40 by 60 feet weighted with sandbags that Bram brought up in his truck lashed to the roof timbers with marine rope through grommets. It would not last the summer, he said, but it would keep the rain off long enough for them to do the real work. The real work, he said, was going to take 3 months. The second week, Cyrus Boone came up the access road in a station wagon that was almost as old as Bram's truck. He was 70 years old, thin, with white hair clipped close to his scalp, and the slow, precise way of speaking that came from 44 years of saying important things over a railroad radio. He had been a Western Maryland dispatcher from 1968 until the line was abandoned, and after that he had worked as a regional safety coordinator for what eventually became Conrail until he had retired in 2012. He had heard about the young woman at the Roundhouse from Bram, who had heard about her from Marlene. He had brought a thermos of coffee and a paper bag full of sandwiches his wife had made. He drank his coffee on the platform and looked at the building for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned to her and said the thing she had not known she had been waiting to hear. I worked the dispatch board the day your father died. She felt the chronometer slow against her chest. I was retired by then. They asked me to come back as a consultant for the inspection program after Conrail took over the line. I was on shift the morning of October 15, 2017. I was the one who logged the last radio call from your father. He called in from the bridge at 7:19. He said he was beginning his inspection and would be off the air for 40 minutes. He never came back on. He paused. He looked at the coffee in his cup as if he had forgotten what it was. The accident report said the bridge collapsed at 7:43. The report was signed by a man named Jasper Holloway, who was the regional general manager. Jasper Holloway died 2 years later. His son Eldon took over the family business interests, and his grandson Tate is the one running the show now. He looked up at her. I have been waiting 8 years for someone to come ask me what I remembered about that morning. Nobody ever did. Not the inspector general. Not the federal investigators, not the family. I assumed they had decided it was an accident, and I assumed I was the only one who knew it wasn't. I read about your purchase in the Intermountain last week. I drove up here today because I wanted to see for myself. He set his coffee down. Whatever you need, Miss Renner, whatever I can do, I am at your disposal. The third week, the Intermountain ran another article. Quinn Larkin, an investigative reporter who had been writing for the regional paper for 6 years, had heard about the Roundhouse from her uncle who knew Bram. She drove up on a Tuesday afternoon and sat with Sloan in the dispatcher's office and asked careful questions and took notes in a small spiral pad. She was 38 years old with red hair pulled back in the same low ponytail Sloan wore, and she had the watchful quiet of a person who had spent her career listening to people who had been waiting a long time to be heard. Sloan did not show her the journal that day. She showed her the building. She showed her the deed. She told her about the radio program and the $10 and her grandfather's career on the Western Maryland. She did not mention her father. She did not mention Tate Holloway. But Quinn was not stupid. Quinn had been reporting on the Holloway family for 4 years. Quinn had asked near the end of the interview, in a voice that was casual but not careless, whether Sloan was related to the Gideon Renner who had died on the Cheat River Bridge in 2017. Sloane had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said yes. Quinn had closed her notebook. "When you're ready to talk about that," she said, "here is my card. I will not write a word about it until you tell me to. But I would like you to know that I've been waiting a long time for someone to want to talk about it." Sloane took the card. She put it in the pocket of her jeans against the chronometer cord, and she didn't say anything else. Quinn left. The fourth week, Sloane found the code in the journal. She'd been reading the entries again, looking for anything she might have missed. Anything Otis Pemberton might have hidden in the routine pages of his 30-year tenure. The journal was densely written, and the handwriting changed subtly over the decades, growing slightly less precise as the man's eyes weakened and his hand grew uncertain. She had read all the way through twice. She started a third pass. It was in an entry from 1992. A routine entry about a freight movement, the kind of entry that did not seem to matter, but at the bottom of the entry in the same careful slanted script Otis Pemberton had written, 4 characters that did not belong to the rest of the page. R. Scene 7. She stared at it. She turned the page. The next entry 3 days later was also routine, but at the bottom, in the same place, in the same careful hand, the same 4 characters. RC-7. She went forward. The notation appeared at the bottom of 17 entries spread across 23 years. The earliest one was from 1992. The latest one was from 2015, 2 years before her father had died. She found Bram in bay number 9 mixing mortar in a bucket. She showed him the journal. He read the notations with the patience he brought to everything. Then he set the journal down and walked out of the office across the floor of the Roundhouse into bay number 7. She followed him. He stood in front of the rear wall of bay number 7 and ran his hand along the brickwork. The bricks were laid in standard running bond alternating headers and stretchers, the way 19th century roundhouses had been built when masonry was still considered structural rather than decorative. But he was running his hand along a single course about 4 feet off the ground, and his fingers had stopped on a section that looked to her exactly like every other section. He pulled a small flat bar out of his back pocket and probed the mortar joint above one of the bricks. The mortar was harder than the surrounding work. It had been replaced, recently enough that the color was still slightly different from the original, even after years of dust. He looked at her. "Your father," he said, "was a careful man. It took them 2 hours to remove the false brickwork without damaging the surrounding wall. The cavity behind it was 18 inches deep, 18 inches wide, and 12 inches high. A metal lockbox fit inside the cavity exactly the way a hand fits inside a glove that has been made for that hand alone. The lockbox was unlocked. The key was taped to the underside of its lid. Inside the lockbox, in a manila envelope sealed with tape that had been applied carefully and never removed, were 47 pages of typed and handwritten documentation, inspection reports, photographs of the failed bridge bolt taken from multiple angles, metallurgical analysis from a private laboratory in Pittsburgh, cross-referenced timesheets showing which inspectors had been scheduled to look at the bridge in the months before the collapse, and which inspections had been canceled or reassigned. A list of names with positions and dates that ran to 2 pages. The list was titled in her father's handwriting, "Persons Having Knowledge." The first name on the list was Jasper Holloway, Regional General Manager, deceased. The second name was Eldon Holloway, Family Business Operations. The third name was a man she did not recognize. The fourth and fifth and sixth she did not recognize either. The seventh name made her sit down on the floor of bay number 7 and stare at the page until the letters lost their meaning. Curtis Sutton, attorney of record settlement negotiations, her stepfather. Her stepfather, who had drawn up the agreement that had paid out the wrongful death settlement to her mother in late 2017. Her stepfather, who had then waited the appropriate number of years for a widow's grief to ease, and had then introduced himself to her mother through a mutual acquaintance, and had then courted her, and had then married her, and had then moved into the house on Stonewall Street where Sloan had lived since she was 4 years old. Her stepfather had been one of the men who had known. Bram knelt on the concrete next to her. He did not touch her. He waited. She found her voice eventually. He married my mother. I heard you. He has been living in our house for 4 years. He was the one who changed the locks. He was the one who left the box on the porch. I know. The chronometer ticked against her chest. She thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table on Stonewall Street, smiling at a man who had known how her first husband had died. She thought about her mother accepting a wedding ring from a man who had drawn up the documents that had bought her silence. She thought about her mother 3 months ago taking the chronometer out of its velvet-lined box and placing it on top of a cardboard box on a porch in February. She thought about what that placement had meant. Her mother had been telling her something. Her mother had been telling her in the only language they had left between them that the watch belonged to Sloan, and Sloan belonged to the watch, and that whatever was happening in the house on Stonewall Street, the watch had to leave with her. The watch had to go where Sloan was going. The watch could not stay with her mother because her mother could not protect it. Her mother had known something was wrong. Her mother had been trying to warn her. She picked up the journal and the manila envelope and the badge of her father, and she put all of them back into the leather satchel, and she carried the satchel back to the dispatcher's office, and she put it under the floor again, and she put the floorboard back over it, and she put the stool back over the floorboard. Bram watched her work without speaking. When she was done, she turned to him. I need to talk to my mother. He did not call her until that night. She used the phone in Loretta's diner, the old wall-mounted unit in the back hallway that Loretta still kept connected because some of her older customers did not own cell phones. She dialed her mother's number. Her mother picked up on the second ring the way her mother had always picked up. And Sloan heard her mother's voice say hello in the careful, tentative way of a woman who had been waiting for a phone call for 2 months and could not quite believe it was finally coming. Sloan did not waste time. I need you to meet me at Loretta's tonight. Come alone. Do not tell Curtis. Do not bring your phone if you can help it. Park around the back. Loretta will let you in through the kitchen. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then her mother said in a voice Sloan had not heard since before her father had died, I will be there in an hour. Maribel Renner Sutton walked into the back room of Loretta's diner 1 hour and 4 minutes later, and Sloan saw her mother for the first time in 3 months and almost did not recognize her. She had lost weight. Her hair, which had been dyed a careful chestnut for the last decade, was showing gray at the roots in the way of a woman who had stopped going to the salon. She was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt and no makeup. Her hands were shaking. She was 48 years old and she looked 60. She closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it, as if she expected someone to come through it after her. I parked at the IGA, she said. I walked the 4 blocks. I left my phone at home in the bedroom. He thinks I'm at my sister's. She looked at her daughter. He found out you bought the Roundhouse. Sloan felt the chronometer tick against her chest. When? This morning. He got a phone call from Tate Holloway. They have known each other for 10 years. He came home after the call, and he went into his office and he closed the door, and he stayed in there for 2 hours. When he came out, his face was the color of paper. He said he had to go to Charleston for a few days. He left an hour ago. Mama, I know I found his name on a list my father made. I have it. I know. How long have you known? Maribel Renner Sutton walked across the small back room of Loretta's diner and sat down on the edge of the cot Loretta kept against the wall for delivery drivers who needed to nap during long hauls. She put her hands together in her lap. She looked at the floor for a long time before she answered. I knew something was wrong about the settlement. I knew that in 2017. The check came too fast and the amount was too large. And the lawyer who showed up at our house was too polite. He was kind to me. He was kind to you. He brought flowers to your father's funeral. He sent a Christmas card every year. He invited me to coffee in 2019. I should have seen it. I did not see it. She raised her eyes. I did not know who he was. Not really. Not until last summer. The chronometer ticked. What happened last summer? I found a folder. He keeps an office at the house. He locks it. I have never had a key. But last June, he had a heart event. He was hospitalized for 4 days. I went into the office to find his medication list. I found a folder in the back of a drawer. It had your father's name on it. It had photographs of the bridge. It had copies of documents I had never seen. I read everything in the folder. I read it for 2 hours sitting on the floor of his office while he was in the hospital. I learned what the settlement had been. I learned what he had done. I learned that he had married me to know what I knew, to know what your father had told me, to know whether your father had left anything behind that could hurt them. Sloane stood very still. The chronometer ticked against her chest with a sound that in the small back room seemed loud enough to fill every silence between them. You did not tell me. I could not tell you. He watched me for the next 3 days when he came home from the hospital. He watched me the way a man watches a witness he is not sure of. He told me on the second night that there had been some things missing from his folder. He asked me if I knew where they were. I told him I did not know what folder he meant. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said he hoped I was telling the truth because he would hate for anything to happen to my daughter. He used those words. He said I would hate for anything to happen to your daughter. I knew then. I knew he was telling me that you were the leverage, that as long as I said nothing and did nothing, you would be allowed to live your life. The moment I went to anyone, the moment I told you, the moment I tried to bring it to a lawyer, anything that he could not control, something would happen to you. So I said nothing. For 7 months. I said nothing and I watched him and I tried to think of a way out that would not get you killed, and I could not find one. She paused. Her hands had stopped shaking. They were folded in her lap now, and she was looking at her daughter the way she had looked at her on the day they had buried her father 8 years ago in the cemetery at Beverly. In February, he came home from a meeting and he told me you needed to leave the house. He said you were getting too close to people he did not trust. He said your job at the coffee shop was a cover. He said you had been asking questions about your father, none of which was true. I knew what he was doing. He was building a justification to drive you out of his sight. He wanted you somewhere he could find you if he needed to find you. He wanted you outside the house so that whatever was going to happen to you would not happen in his house. I had a choice. I could refuse and watch him do something worse. Or I could do what he said and use the only signal I had left. She looked at the chronometer cord around Sloane's neck, the leather worn dark against her shirt. Your grandfather wound that watch every Sunday at 6. He kept it accurate to 3 seconds a month. He told you when he gave it to you that it was the only thing of his that mattered. I knew you would understand. Sloane could not speak. Her mother continued. I took it out of the box. I put it on top of the cardboard. I knew Curtis would not understand what it meant. He was not a railroad man. He did not know what a chronometer was. He saw it as jewelry. I knew you would see it as something else. I knew you would see it as a flare. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I have not been your mother for 4 years. I'm sorry I did not find a way out before now. I'm sorry that the only thing I could do was send you a watch. Sloane crossed the small back room and knelt in front of her mother, and put her arms around her, and her mother held her back, and the chronometer ticked between their two chests, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The plan came together over the next 4 days. Sloan drove down to the Intermountain office in Elkins on a Sunday morning and sat across the desk from Quinn Larkin and laid out everything. The journal, the hidden documentation, the list of names. Her stepfather's confession in code told to her mother through a heart attack, and a folder he had been careless enough to leave in a desk. She told Quinn what her mother had agreed to do. Quinn took notes for 90 minutes without interrupting. When Sloan was finished, Quinn closed her notebook and looked at her for a long moment. "I will run a 3-part series. I will start it the day after the hearing. I will name every person on that list. I have a contact at the FBI field office in Charleston who's been waiting for something like this for a long time. With your permission, I will reach out to her tonight." Sloan gave her permission. Marlene Whitley made the second call. She'd been a county clerk for 22 years, and she had relationships with people in 3 federal agencies, and she knew how to phrase a tip in a way that would get attention without compromising the source. She placed the call to the FBI field office in Charleston on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, 2 agents had driven up to Parsons Junction and met with Sloan in the dispatcher's office of the Roundhouse and looked at the contents of the leather satchel for 90 minutes and asked careful questions and made photocopies of every page. They told her before they left that an investigation had already been opened 4 months earlier, based on tips from another source they could not identify. They told her without quite saying it that her father's documentation was the missing piece they had been waiting for. They told her not to tell anyone about their visit. She did not tell anyone. Cyrus Boone made the 3rd call. He had a former dispatch colleague who had retired to Charleston and now worked part-time as a court clerk at the federal courthouse. The colleague did not have access to sealed proceedings, but he had access to filing schedules and witness lists, and he was willing to keep his eyes open for anything that might relate to the names on the list Sloan had photocopied for him. Bram Calloway did not make any calls. Bram Calloway loaded his truck on Wednesday evening with every piece of camping equipment he owned and drove up to the Roundhouse and set up a cot in bay number 7, and announced that he would be sleeping there until further notice. He was 72 years old. He had a back injury from 1981 that had never quite healed. He did not appear to care. "You are not staying alone in this building," he said. "Not after what your stepfather knows." Sloan did not argue with him. The hearing was set for Friday, May 14th at 11 in the morning in the small courthouse in Parsons. Tate Holloway had filed for emergency injunctive relief on grounds that the deed transfer had been improperly executed, that the property was structurally unsafe for habitation, and that demolition should proceed on schedule the following morning, regardless of ownership. His attorneys had requested expedited consideration. The judge had granted it. The Roundhouse was scheduled to be demolished at 8 in the morning on May 15th. If Sloan lost the hearing, she would have less than 21 hours to remove every piece of evidence from the building before the bulldozers arrived. She did not intend to lose the hearing. But on the night of May 10th, 4 nights before the hearing, she lost something else. She woke at 2:17 in the morning to the smell of smoke. She was sleeping in the dispatcher's office on the cot Bram had brought up. Bram was sleeping in bay number 7. The smell was wrong, was sharp. Was the chemical reek of accelerant rather than the mineral smell of an old building producing its slow exhalations. She sat up. The chronometer was on the desk. She grabbed it and put it around her neck and pulled on her boots. The fire was already in 3 bays. She came out of the dispatcher's office and saw the orange light along the rafters of bays 5, 6, and 7. Climbing fast through dry timbers that had been waiting for an opportunity for 60 years. Bram was on his feet in bay 7, beating at the flames on the floor with his coat. The accelerant pattern was visible even in the smoke. Whoever had set the fire had walked through the building, pouring fuel along the wooden bench fronts and the door frames and the platform boards, and had then ignited it from the rear and walked back out through the front. The leather satchel was under the floorboard in the dispatcher's office. She turned and ran back into the small office and pulled up the floorboard and grabbed the satchel and turned to run back out, and that was when the rafter above the dispatcher's office gave way. The beam fell forward and downward and caught her across the left side of her body, and the heat of it through her shirt felt like the bottom of a stove pressed against her ribs. And she heard her own scream as if it were coming from someone else, and she fell to the floor of the office with the satchel still gripped in her right hand. Her left arm would not move. Her left side would not move. The smoke was thick now, was filling the small office, was making it impossible to see the door. She heard Bram shouting her name. She tried to answer. She could not get enough air to answer. Then she felt his hands under her arms lifting her, dragging her across the floor of the office and out into the main room of the Roundhouse, dragging her through the smoke and the heat toward the door of bay number 7. She held the satchel against her chest with her right arm. Her left arm hung useless at her side. They came out into the cold spring night. The roof of the Roundhouse was fully involved now. The flames were visible above the brick walls, lighting the trees along the access road. Bram dragged her clear of the building and laid her down on the gravel and unbuttoned her shirt and looked at the burn along her ribs, and his face did something she had never seen his face do. He pulled out his phone and called 911. She was conscious when the ambulance arrived. She was conscious when they loaded her into the back. She was conscious enough to give the satchel to Bram and to tell him in a voice that was barely audible over the diesel of the ambulance engine to keep it safe, to give it to Quinn Larkin in the morning, to tell Cyrus to make copies of everything before noon. Bram took the satchel. He nodded once. He did not say anything. The ambulance doors closed. She woke at 6:14 in the morning in a hospital bed at Davis Memorial in Elkins. Her left side was wrapped in gauze from her ribs to her hip. An IV ran into her right arm. The chronometer was on the bedside table, still on its leather cord, the second hand moving at perfect railroad time. A nurse was standing at the foot of the bed. "Miss Renner, there is a deputy sheriff outside who needs to speak with you. He says it is important." The deputy was a young man, perhaps 25, in a uniform that had been pressed that morning. He took off his hat when he came into the room. He looked at the bandages along her side, and he looked at the chronometer on the bedside table, and he looked at her face, and he said the words he had been told to say. "Miss Renner, we need to ask you some questions about your mother." Sloan felt the room go cold. "What about my mother?" Maribel Sutton was reported missing this morning. Her vehicle was found at 540 on Route 219, 3 miles south of the Pendleton County line. The vehicle was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. There is no sign of her. Her phone is in the vehicle. Her purse is in the vehicle. He paused. He looked at his hat in his hand. "We are treating it as a missing persons case. Your stepfather, Curtis Sutton, has been notified. He is on his way back from Charleston. He will be here by noon." Sloan stared at him. The chronometer ticked in the bedside table. The roof of her grandfather's roundhouse was a black ruin 12 miles up the road, and her stepfather was driving back from Charleston, and her mother was missing. And her left side felt as if someone had laid a hot iron against it, and she had 4 hours until the man who had been sleeping in her childhood bedroom for 4 years walked into her hospital room and looked at her with whatever expression he had decided to wear. She looked at the deputy. She kept her voice level. "I need a phone," she said. "I need to make some calls." The deputy left the room. The nurse brought her a hospital phone on a long extension cord and set it on the bedside table next to the chronometer and pulled the privacy curtain around the bed. Sloan Renner picked up the receiver with her right hand because her left hand would not yet close around anything heavier than a paper cup. She called Bram first. He picked up on the first ring. She could hear in the background the sound of voices and the slow movement of vehicles on gravel. She knew without having to ask that he had not slept, that he had been at the Roundhouse since she had been loaded into the ambulance, that he had not left the smoking ruin alone for a single minute in case the people who had set the fire came back to look for what they had failed to destroy. She did not waste words. "My mother is missing. They found her car on Route 219. Curtis is on his way back from Charleston. He will be at the hospital by noon. I need the satchel out of your truck and somewhere safe by then. I need Quinn to have copies of everything in the next 2 hours. I need Cyrus to call his man at the federal courthouse and tell him whatever is happening today." Bram was silent for a moment. Then he said in the same level voice he had used the day she had shown him the journal, "Already done the first 3. Quinn has been at my house since 5 this morning. She is making copies right now. Cyrus made the call at 6. The federal warrant for Holloway development came through at 7:04. 2 agents out of Charleston are on their way to Tate Holloway's office in Parsons. They expect to serve it before 9. She closed her eyes. "What about my mother?" "Cyrus is making calls. We are working on it." When she opened her eyes again, she said the thing that had been rising in her throat since the deputy had left the room. "Bram. He is going to come into this hospital and he is going to put a hand on me and he is going to tell the nurses that he is family and he is going to take me out of this room." Bram was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "No, he is not." He hung up. She set the receiver down on the bedside table and lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling tiles and listened to the chronometer tick beside her ear and waited for whatever Bram had decided to do. Bram was already pulling out of the gravel turnaround at the bottom of the access road when he ended the call. The Roundhouse sat behind him in the morning light. A brick shell opened to the sky. The roof timbers collapsed into the bays in great black piles, still smoking gently in the May air. Cyrus Boone was standing near the front door of bay number 7, with 2 state fire marshals pointing out the empty gasoline can his deputies had bagged at 4 in the morning. The can had a Holloway development logo molded into the plastic. The lab work was already in motion. Bram drove 12 miles to Davis Memorial Hospital in Elkins. He did not exceed the speed limit. He did not run any lights. He had spent 50 years learning that careful men finished what they started and reckless men did not. And he was not going to become a reckless man at the age of 72. He parked in the visitor lot. He took a small canvas duffel out of the back of the truck. The duffel contained nothing illegal. It contained a folding chair, a thermos of black coffee, a paperback novel he had been reading for 3 weeks, and a cell phone with 3 numbers programmed into it. He carried the duffel through the front doors of the hospital and rode the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked down the corridor to room 317. The deputy sheriff was still in the corridor. He was a young man, and he looked tired. Bram set the duffel down. He held out his hand. "Bram Calloway. I am the master mason on Miss Renner's restoration crew. I've been working with her since the 2nd week of April. Her grandfather was a friend of mine. I would like permission to sit outside this door until the hospital releases her." The deputy looked at the duffel. He looked at the 72-year-old man with hands the size of cast iron skillets. He looked at the badge on his own uniform. "You expecting trouble, sir?" Bram looked down the corridor in the direction of the elevators. "I am expecting Curtis Sutton. He is on his way from Charleston. I have reason to believe he intends to remove Miss Renner from this room against her wishes. I am going to sit outside this door and make sure that does not happen." The deputy was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the radio off his belt and called for a 2nd deputy and then a 3rd, and within 20 minutes there were 2 uniformed deputies and 1 state trooper in the corridor outside room 317. And Bram Calloway had set up his folding chair against the wall opposite the door and was reading his paperback novel and drinking his coffee and waiting. Curtis Sutton arrived at 11:47. He came up the elevator alone. He was wearing a pressed white shirt and a tie and a gray suit jacket that had been brushed clean of lint that morning, the way a lawyer's jacket was always brushed clean before court. His face was carefully composed in the expression of a worried husband. He had practiced it in the rearview mirror on the long drive back from Charleston. He came around the corner of the corridor and saw the 3 uniformed officers standing outside room 317, and he saw the 72-year-old man in the folding chair. And his expression did not change, but his footsteps slowed by a fraction of a second, the kind of fraction only a man like Bram Calloway would have noticed. Curtis stopped in front of the door. "I am here for my stepdaughter. I would like to see her." The state trooper stepped between Curtis and the door. "Sir, Miss Renner has requested no visitors at this time. I am her family. She has requested no visitors. We will let her know you are here. If she wishes to see you, she will say so." Curtis Sutton was not a man who was used to being refused. His expression flickered for a half second, the practiced concern slipping just enough to show what was underneath. And then the practiced concern came back down over his face like a curtain falling on a stage. He nodded slowly. He looked at the trooper. He looked at the deputies. He looked finally at Bram Calloway. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. Bram did not look away. He did not stand up. He did not say anything. He simply held Curtis Sutton's gaze with the same level patience he had used on the brickwork of Bay Number 7, the patience of a man who has worked with hard materials for 50 years and knows that hard materials always yield eventually if you wait them out. Curtis Sutton was the first to look away. He turned to the trooper. He nodded once. He said in the voice of a polite professional being told that an appointment was running late, "I will be in the cafeteria when she is ready." He walked back down the corridor, and he rode the elevator down to the cafeteria, and he sat at a table near the window, and he ordered a cup of coffee. He did not drink, and he was still sitting there. 43 minutes later, when the 2 FBI agents from the Charleston field office walked in and arrested him on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and accessory to wrongful death, and led him out of the cafeteria in handcuffs while every patient and visitor in the room watched in silence. Sloan learned about the arrest from Quinn Larkin, who called the hospital phone at 12:30. She listened. She thanked Quinn. She set the receiver down on the cradle. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling tiles and tried to feel something. She tried to feel triumph. She tried to feel relief. She could not feel either of those things because her mother was still missing, and the journal entry she had read 3 weeks ago was the only proof she had that her mother had ever come back to her at all. The chronometer ticked beside her ear. She slept for 2 hours. When she woke, Quinn was sitting in the chair by the bed. Quinn had been there for 20 minutes. She had brought a thermos of soup from her apartment and a blanket from her own bed because the hospital blankets were thin, and she remembered her grandmother's hospital stays. She did not speak when Sloan opened her eyes. She poured a small amount of soup into a paper cup and held it where Sloan could reach it with her right hand. Sloan drank the soup slowly. Then Quinn said the FBI raided Holloway Development at 8:47 this morning. They have everything. Tate Holloway is in custody on charges related to the fire. The arson investigation is moving fast. They found accelerant residue on his suit jacket in a hamper at his house. He is going to be charged with attempted murder by the end of the day. Sloan nodded slowly. What about Eldon? Quinn paused. Eldon Holloway is at his home in Davis. The FBI has not arrested him. They have him under what they are calling protective surveillance. Why? I don't know yet. What about my mother? Quinn set the soup cup down on the bedside table. Cyrus called me 40 minutes ago. He has a contact at the state police barracks in Elkins. The state police got a call at 5:30 this morning from a private caregiver in Davis. The caregiver said a woman matching your mother's description was at the Holloway residence. The caregiver said the woman had walked up the driveway at 4 in the morning and rung the doorbell and asked to speak to Eldon Holloway. The caregiver said Eldon had let her in, and they'd been talking ever since. The chronometer ticked. Sloan stared at her. My mother went to Eldon Holloway's house. Yes, voluntarily. Yes, why? Quinn looked at her steadily, because she figured something out that nobody else has figured out. Maribel Renner Sutton was sitting in a wing chair in the front parlor of the Holloway residence in Davis, West Virginia, when the FBI agents came up the driveway at 1:15 in the afternoon. The chair was upholstered in dark green damask. The parlor was paneled in walnut. The fireplace had been laid for a fire that no one had bothered to light because the May afternoon was warm enough to make a fire unnecessary. Eldon Holloway sat across from her in a wheelchair. He was 76 years old. His hair was white. His skin was the color of old paper. The portable oxygen concentrator on the table beside him hissed and ticked at regular intervals. He was wearing a cardigan sweater over a button-down shirt that had been ironed by someone other than him. Maribel had been in the parlor for 9 hours. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She had drunk 3 cups of tea that the caregiver had brought in on a silver tray. She had been speaking to Eldon Holloway in a voice that did not rise and did not break since the moment he had let her into the house at 4 in the morning. When the agents knocked on the front door, Eldon Holloway looked at her. I told you they would come. I knew they would come. You can leave now if you want. You do not have to be here when they take me. She looked at him. She had known him in passing for almost 20 years. Her first husband had spoken about him sometimes the way working men speak about owners, with neither warmth nor hatred, with the careful neutrality of people who understood that owners belonged to a different country. She had met him once at a Christmas party in 2008. He had been 60 years old then, and he had been a state senator, and he had shaken her hand, and he had said her husband was a fine inspector, and the regional office was lucky to have him. He had said that to her in 2008, 9 years before he had signed the documents that authorized her husband's death. She had come to his house at 4 in the morning to ask him a single question, and she had spent 9 hours getting an answer. I will be here, she said. I will be here when they take you, and I will be the witness. Eldon Holloway nodded slowly. The oxygen concentrator hissed. Then he wheeled himself toward the parlor door, and Maribel followed him, and they answered the door together when the agents knocked the second time. Sloan left the hospital against medical advice on the morning of May 13th. Her left side was still wrapped in gauze. The burns were 2nd degree across her ribs and 1st degree along her hip. The doctor had wanted her to stay another 48 hours for observation. She had told the doctor that the demolition of the Parsons Junction Roundhouse had been canceled by federal court order at 3 o'clock the previous afternoon, but that the hearing on the deed transfer was still scheduled for 11 on the morning of the 14th, and that she intended to be there. The doctor had argued. She had not. Bram drove her up to Parsons in his pickup. Cyrus Boone followed in his station wagon. Loretta Bishop had closed the diner for the day and driven up in a borrowed Buick with Marlene Whitley in the passenger seat. Quinn Larkin came in her own car with a photographer in the front seat and a stack of newspapers in the back. The first installment of her 3-part series had run that morning under a headline that was already being picked up by the wire services. The courthouse in Parsons was a small 2-story building made of brick and limestone. It had been built in 1898. It had a single courtroom on the 2nd floor with 12 rows of wooden pews and a high judge's bench at the front and tall windows that looked out over the main street of the town. The courtroom had a capacity of 86 people. By 10:30 in the morning, there were 240 people trying to get inside. Quinn's series had been picked up by the Charleston Gazette-Mail at 6 in the morning. By 8, the Associated Press had run a national story. By 9, 3 television trucks from Pittsburgh and Charleston had set up on the main street outside the courthouse. Reporters from 4 other papers had driven up overnight. The bailiff was turning people away at the door. Sloane Renner walked through the crowd on Bram Calloway's arm because her left side still would not bear her weight without help. She was wearing a dark blue blouse her mother had bought her 3 years ago, and jeans and the boots she had worn the morning she had bought the building. The chronometer hung on its leather cord over the blouse visible. She had decided that morning getting dressed in the hospital that she was not going to hide it. The journal was in a manila envelope under her right arm. The crowd parted as they walked toward the courthouse steps. People said her name. People reached out to touch her shoulder as she passed. A man she had never seen before, an old man with a Western Maryland Railway cap on his head, took off the cap as she went by. She did not know what to do with any of it. She kept walking. Bram led her up the steps and into the building and up the stairs to the courtroom. Tate Holloway was at the defense table when they came in. He was wearing a different suit than the one he had worn to the Roundhouse a month earlier. This one was dark gray rather than dark blue. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. He was no longer wearing handcuffs because he had been released on bail the previous afternoon, and the conditions of his bail required him to appear at the hearing his own attorneys had scheduled. His face was the color of a man who had not slept in 3 days. He did not look at Sloane when she came in. She and Bram took seats in the front pew on the left side of the courtroom, the side reserved for the petitioners. Cyrus and Loretta and Marlene sat behind them. Quinn sat in the press section. Other reporters filled the rest of the pews on both sides until the bailiff closed the doors. The judge came in at 11:04. She was a woman in her late 50s named Patricia Vaughn. She had been on the bench for 19 years. She had a reputation for impatience with theatrics and a longer reputation for fairness. She sat down. She looked at the courtroom. She looked at the defense table. She looked at the petitioner's table where Sloane sat alone except for Bram because Sloane had decided that morning in the hospital that she did not want an attorney to speak for her at this hearing. Judge Vaughn looked at the docket sheet in front of her. This is the matter of Holloway Development LLC versus Sloane Renner, a hearing on the petitioner's motion for emergency injunctive relief regarding the deed transfer of the property at Parsons Junction. Mr. Halloran, you represent Holloway Development. Tate's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. Miss Renner, you are appearing pro se. Yes, Your Honor. I have reviewed the briefs. I have also reviewed the federal indictment that was unsealed at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, naming your client, Mr. Halloran, on charges of arson, attempted murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. I have also reviewed the additional indictments naming Curtis Sutton, who I understand is in federal custody, and Eldon Holloway, who I understand is also in federal custody as of yesterday afternoon. Mr. Halloran, do you wish to proceed with your motion for injunctive relief? Tate Holloway's attorney looked at his client. His client was looking down at the table. Your Honor, the attorney said, in light of recent developments, my client wishes to withdraw the motion. Motion withdrawn. The deed of record stands. Miss Renner is the lawful owner of the property in question, the county's demolition order having been suspended yesterday by federal injunction, pending the criminal proceedings, is now permanently rescinded by this court. Judge Vaughn paused. She looked at Sloane. Miss Renner, I'm told that you wish to make a statement to the court today, regardless of the disposition of the motion. The court will hear you if you wish to speak. Sloane stood. Bram stood with her, his hand at her elbow, supporting the side that would not support itself. She looked at the judge. She looked at Tate Holloway, who was still looking down at the table. She looked at the gallery, at the reporters and the railroad men with their caps in their laps. and the strangers who had come because they had read Quinn's article that morning and had wanted to be present at whatever was about to happen. She had not prepared a speech. She opened the manila envelope and she took out a single piece of paper. It was a photocopy of a letter. The original was in a safe deposit box at a bank in Charleston where Quinn had taken it for her the previous evening. She read the letter aloud. The letter was dated August 2nd, 2018. It had been written on a single sheet of yellow legal paper in a hand that Sloan had recognized the moment she had unfolded it from inside the lining of the leather satchel. 3 weeks earlier, the hand of her grandfather, Wendell Renner, written 10 months after her father's death and 8 months before her grandfather's own, to my granddaughter Sloan. If you are reading this, you have found your way to the building where I spent the first 12 years of my working life. I cannot tell you whether you found it on your own or whether someone told you about it, but I can tell you that you would not have come looking for it unless something had gone wrong. Something has gone wrong. I am writing this letter because I am old and tired, and I do not believe I have many years left, and I do not want to leave this work for someone who does not know what she is looking for. Your father came to see me 4 days before he died. He brought me documentation he had collected. He brought me his inspector's badge. He brought me a chronometer he had carried for 9 years. He told me he believed he was going to be killed, and he asked me to help him hide what he had found. I told him I would. I told him I would hide it where the people who wanted him dead would not look. I told him I would hide it in 2 places because one place was not enough. The first place is in the floor of the dispatcher's office at the Parsons Junction Roundhouse. Otis Pemberton helped me. Otis is an old friend and a careful man, and he has agreed to keep watch over what we hid there for as long as he is able. The second place is in the chronometer itself. The chronometer your grandfather gave you. The one I gave you, the one you wear around your neck. Your father suggested it. He said no one would ever look inside a watch. He said the people who were going to come after his evidence would tear apart his house and his car and his office, but they would not think to look inside a railroad watch worn around the neck of a 12-year-old girl. He said he wanted you to have the watch when I died. He said you were the only Renner left who would understand what to do with it. I had the back of the watch resealed by a jeweler in Pittsburgh in the fall of 2017. I told the jeweler I was reinforcing the case. He did not ask any other questions. He charged me $60. Inside the case behind the movement is a small roll of microfilm. The microfilm contains 30 pages of your father's documentation copied from the originals before we hid them at the Roundhouse. The microfilm also contains an audio recording your father made on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2017. The recording is of Eldon Holloway speaking in his office at the family residence. Your father obtained it through means I did not ask him to explain. The recording is clear. The recording is dated. The recording leaves no room for interpretation about what the Holloway family did or why they did it. If you are reading this letter, I am asking you to take the watch to a jeweler. Have him open the back. Take what is inside to the people who can use it. I am sorry. I am sorry that this work has fallen to you. I am sorry that I was not strong enough to do it myself when I still had the years to do it. I am sorry that your father is not here to do it with you. I am sorry that my generation did not finish the work and left it for yours. But I believe in you. I have believed in you since you were old enough to wind a watch on a Sunday at 6 o'clock. You are a Renner. You are the granddaughter of railroad men. The work is in your hands now. Wendell Renner, August 2nd, 2018. The courtroom was silent when she finished reading. She lowered the letter. She lifted the chronometer over her head and held it out on its leather cord in front of the judge's bench. I had a jeweler in Charleston open it last night. She set the watch on the petitioner's table. Beside it, she set a small, clear plastic envelope containing a roll of microfilm. Quinn Larkin in the press section stood up. "Your Honor, I have copies of the contents of that microfilm which were transferred yesterday evening. With the court's permission, I would like to introduce them into the record." Judge Vaughn looked at her. "The court will accept the materials, Miss Larkin, but this is not a criminal trial. This is a civil hearing on a deed transfer. The materials will be referred to the United States Attorney's Office, where they belong." She looked back at Sloan. "Miss Renner, the court is satisfied that the deed is valid and the property is yours. I do not believe there is any further matter for this court to consider today." Then the back doors of the courtroom opened. The bailiff turned. The reporters turned. The gallery turned. Maribel Renner Sutton walked into the courtroom. She was wearing the same flannel shirt she had worn the night she had come to Loretta's. Her hair was uncombed. She had been in a federal vehicle for 90 minutes, and before that she had been in a parlor for 9 hours. And before that she had walked up a long driveway in the dark at 4 in the morning to ring a doorbell. She looked exhausted. She walked down the aisle of the courtroom slowly. She didn't look at Tate Holloway. She didn't look at the reporters. She looked at her daughter. She came to the front pew. She slid in beside Bram. She put her hand on Sloan's shoulder. She did not say anything. Sloan Renner stood at the petitioner's table with her mother's hand on her shoulder and her grandfather's letter in her right hand and her chronometer on the table in front of her. And she understood with a clarity she had not yet allowed herself to feel that the work was finished. The work her father had begun in the summer of 2017 was finished. The work her grandfather had carried in 2018 was finished. The work she had started on a porch in February in the snow was finished. She turned to her mother. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the courtroom needed to hear. She put her arms around her mother and held her for a long time while the gallery watched in silence. And the chronometer ticked on the petitioner's table, keeping perfect railroad time, 3 seconds per month, the way it had kept time for her grandfather and her father and her, the way it would keep time for whatever came next. 4 years later, on a Saturday morning in May of 2029, Sloan Renner unlocked the front door of the Western Maryland Memorial Museum and Free Coffee Station at 6 o'clock in the morning, the way she had unlocked it every Saturday morning for 48 months. The Roundhouse had been rebuilt, not entirely and not without compromise. 3 of the 12 bays had been beyond saving and had been rebuilt with new brick that did not quite match the old. The roof had been reframed entirely. The dispatcher's office had been preserved exactly as it had been, including the loose floorboard, which was now mounted under glass with a small bronze plaque explaining what had been hidden beneath it for 8 years. The carved name of Otis Pemberton remained on the desk. A photograph of him, which his daughter had donated to the museum after reading Quinn Larkin's series, hung above it. Bay number 7 held the main exhibit, photographs of the Cheat River Bridge, copies of the documentation her father had collected, a transcript of the recording of Eldon Holloway, who had pleaded guilty in federal court 18 months after the fire and had been sentenced to 14 years, and who had died of pneumonia in a federal medical facility 9 months into his sentence. A copy of the federal indictment of Tate Holloway, who had been convicted of arson and attempted murder and conspiracy, and was currently serving 22 years at the Federal Correctional Institution in Hazleton. A copy of the federal indictment of Curtis Sutton, who had pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and accessory to wrongful death and was currently serving 12 years. The badge of Gideon Renner Conrail Inspector was displayed in a case at the back of bay number 7. The case was lit from below. The engraving on the front of the badge caught the light the way it had caught the light on the morning Sloan had first lifted it out of the cavity beneath the dispatcher's floor. She had not put it back under glass without consideration. She had thought about it for a year. She had decided eventually that her father had hidden the badge because he had been afraid. He was no longer afraid. The badge could come out into the light. The chronometer ticked on the counter beside the coffee maker. Two of them, actually. Hers and Otis Pemberton's, which his daughter had given her after the trial was over. The two watches sat side by side on a small wooden stand Bram Calloway had built for them, and Sloane wound them both at 6 o'clock every Sunday evening, the way her grandfather had wound his watch every Sunday at 6 for 33 years. She started the coffee. She set out the mugs. She opened the door of bay number 7, which served as the public entrance, and propped it open with a cast-iron doorstop Loretta Bishop had given her as a museum opening gift. Maribel Renner pulled into the parking lot at 6:15. She had moved up to Parsons 2 years earlier into a small house 3 blocks from the museum. She volunteered at the museum on Saturday and Sunday mornings, pouring coffee and answering visitor questions the way Loretta Bishop had volunteered for the first 18 months, until her arthritis had made it too hard for her to be on her feet for long stretches. Loretta still came up on the 3rd Saturday of every month, driven by Marlene Whitley, who had retired from the county clerk's office in 2027 and now spent her time on whatever needed her attention. Maribel hung her jacket on the hook by the door. She kissed her daughter's temple. She poured herself a cup of coffee. The first visitor of the day came in at 6:22. He was a man in his late 60s, wearing a Western Maryland Railway cap, the kind of cap the railroad had stopped issuing in 1983, but that you could still find at estate sales if you knew where to look. He took the cap off when he came through the door. He drank his coffee standing on the platform, looking at the brickwork of the rebuilt bays. He told Sloane when she came over to refill his cup that his father had worked the line out of Hagerstown for 28 years. He didn't pay for the coffee because the coffee was free, the way Otis Pemberton had served coffee to railroad men on cold mornings for 30 years, the way her grandfather had done at his kitchen table on Stonewall Street, the way her father had done in the inspector's break room at the Conrail Division office when he had still been alive to do it. The man left a $5 bill in the donations jar on his way out. The donations jar fed the maintenance fund. The maintenance fund had grown over 4 years to the point where the building no longer needed her active fundraising, and she could spend her time on the work that mattered, which was the work of opening the door at 6 o'clock and pouring the coffee and listening to whatever the visitors had to say. Bram Calloway came in at 7:04. He was 76 years old now. He moved slower than he had moved in the spring of 2025. He still came up every Saturday and Sunday morning for an hour or two to sit on the platform and drink coffee and look at the building he had helped Sloane rebuild. He had retired from active masonry work 2 years earlier. He still had hands the size of cast iron skillets. He still had pale gray eyes. He sat down at the table by the window. Maribel brought him his coffee without being asked. Bram nodded his thanks. He looked through the bay door at the empty rail bed where the tracks had been pulled up 65 years before, and he sipped his coffee and watched the morning light come up over the eastern ridge. Cyrus Boone arrived at 7:15. Quinn Larkin, who had won a regional journalism award for her 3-part series and was now writing a book about the Holloway case, came in at 7:30 with her notebook. The regulars came in. The strangers came in. The morning unfolded the way Saturday mornings had unfolded at the museum for 48 months, slow and patient and steady, like the second hand of a chronometer keeping railroad time. Sloane Renner stood behind the counter in the dispatcher's office of her grandfather's real home, and she poured coffee for whoever walked through the door, and she thought about her father. She thought about him in the way she had learned to think about him over the last 4 years, which was without anger and without the particular grief that had defined the years between his death and the morning she had first walked into the Roundhouse. She thought about him as a man who had finished his work. The work had taken 8 years longer than he had expected. The work had required his daughter to finish what he had begun. But the work was finished. The chronometers ticked side by side on the wooden stand on the counter. A man's real home, her grandfather had told her on a Saturday afternoon in October when she had been 7 years old, is the place where he does the work that matters, not the place where he sleeps, the place where the work happens. She had found her real home. It had taken her a long time to get there. It had cost her more than she had known she had to give. But the door was open, and the coffee was hot, and the morning was beautiful, and somewhere down the abandoned railbed, the dogwoods were blooming, and her mother was pouring a cup of coffee for an old man in a Western Maryland railway cap, and Bram Calloway was sitting by the window, and the chronometers were keeping perfect railroad time on the counter, and Sloane Renner, 24 years old, the granddaughter and daughter of railroad men, the keeper of a building that had been waiting for her since the day she had been born, understood with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly the work she was supposed to do, and that the work would continue, patient and unhurried and honest, for as long as she had the years to do it. Outside the bay door, the sun came up over the eastern ridge of the Allegheny Mountains. A new day began. The chronometers kept time.